There's something I've always found interesting about Steven Universe, and it's not the gem powers or the beach city setting or even the songs, though the songs are genuinely excellent. It's the fact that the show names things, real things, clinical things. At one point in the later run, a character sits in a hospital room and has a doctor explain to her what adverse childhood experiences are, and what cortisol does to a body under chronic stress, and why someone might physically react to minor inconveniences as though their life is in danger. That's not a normal thing for a cartoon to do. That's not a normal thing for most television to do, actually. And that's sort of what tonight is going to be about. We're going to sit with Steven as a character, Steven Universe specifically, the half-human, half-gem kid from Beach City, and look at him through a psychological lens, not to formally diagnose a cartoon, because that would be a bit silly, but because his arc maps onto real clinical territory with unusual precision. The show's creator, Rebecca Sugar, has been open about the fact that she drew from her own experiences with emotional labor, burnout, and the particular exhaustion that comes from building your entire identity around being useful to other people. That personal thread runs through every season. So what we're going to do is spend a couple of hours just talking through it. The family system Steven grew up in, the way his powers reflect his psychology, the moment in Steven Universe future when everything catches up to him, the gems themselves as psychological subjects, because Pearl and Amethyst and Garnet are each doing something specific and interesting. Rose Quartz, the pink diamond revelation and what that does to a kid who has been carrying his mother's legacy since he was old enough to understand he had one. It's a lot of ground. We'll take it slowly. If you haven't watched the show, that's fine. I'll give you enough context as we go. If you have watched it, hopefully some of this reframes things you already noticed but maybe didn't have words for. And if you just want something calm to fall asleep to while someone nerds out about a cartoon in good faith, well, that's genuinely the spirit of the thing. One small note before we start. If any of this sounds like content you'd enjoy seeing more of, a subscribe takes about 3 seconds and costs nothing. Genuinely appreciated. One last thing before we begin. Tonight's pacing is deliberately slow. There's no build up to a big climax, no moment where everything clicks into place and you're supposed to feel the revelation. Each section is its own contained thing. You can fall asleep at any point and it won't matter, because there's no payoff you're working toward. It's just someone going through ideas one at a time, spending time in them, and then moving to the next one. That's the format. It suits the material, I think, because Steven's story is not really a payoff story. It's a slow unfolding one, a process, not a resolution, which is incidentally also what the research says recovery actually looks like, but we'll get to that. Right, let's start. Steven Universe premiered on Cartoon Network in 2013 and ran, in various forms, until 2020. It was created by Rebecca Sugar, who was at the time one of the staff writers on Adventure Time and became, with this show, the first non-binary creator to have a solo animated series on a major network. That biographical detail matters not because it's trivia, but because Sugar's personal relationship with identity. What it means to exist between categories, to not fit neatly into the boxes you're handed, is genuinely visible in the text of the show. The premise is this. Steven Universe is a 14-year-old boy, give or take. The show is vague about his exact age across his run, living in a small coastal town called Beach City on the American East Coast. He lives with 3 beings called gems, Pearl, Amethyst, and Garnet, who are ancient alien warriors originally from a place called Homeworld. They're called crystal gems, and they've been protecting the Earth from various gem-related threats for thousands of years. Steven's mother, Rose Quartz, was the leader of the crystal gems and gave up her physical form when Steven was born, which is how he exists at all. He inherited her gem, a pale pink rose embedded in his stomach, and with it, her powers, which are healing and shielding mostly. Defensive powers, worth noting. His father, Greg Universe, is a warm, slightly chaotic human man who lives in a van and used to be a musician. He and Steven have a genuinely loving relationship. Greg is around, he's present. He just isn't entirely equipped to navigate the gem world, so he exists somewhat adjacent to the main story for much of the series. The show starts fairly light, Steven has adventures with the gems, they fight gem monsters. He learns to use his powers, there's a lot of music and comedy and genuine warmth, but it deepens over time, gradually, then quite suddenly, into something much more complicated. By the final season of the original series, and then through the epilogue run called Steven Universe Future, which aired in 2019 and 2020, it's become a story about intergenerational trauma, identity, and what happens to a child who has been everyone's emotional anchor for his entire life. There's a design detail that Rebecca Sugar has mentioned in interviews, which is that each of the crystal gems was deliberately built to represent a stage of human emotional development. Steven, she said, is codependent. His emotional life is organized entirely around other people. Amethyst is counterdependent, the rebel who rejects authority and operates on instinct. Pearl is group dependent, the one who needs rules and structure and a sense of duty. And Garnet is independent, the most emotionally mature of the group, able to contain her own complexity and support others without losing herself. I find that design choice genuinely interesting because it means the show was always, at some level, a story about different ways of relating to the world and what each of those ways costs you. Steven sits at the codependent end of that spectrum, and everything that follows from that choice, every arc, every crisis, every moment in future where things start to break down, flows from it pretty naturally if you know what to look for. The show is also notable for how explicitly it handles mental health in its final phase. Not metaphorically, or only metaphorically, but with actual clinical language. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, are named by a doctor in an episode called Growing Pains. PTSD is the framework the show applies to Steven's deteriorating state in future. He ends the entire series having started therapy. These aren't incidental details. They're the thesis. But before we get to future, we need to understand how Steven got there. And that means starting with the family he was raised in, which is one of the more unusual arrangements you'll find in children's television. A few more contextual notes worth having before we move on. The music in Steven Universe is original and integral to the storytelling. Rebecca Sugar and the composers use songs as the show's emotional vocabulary, saying things in musical form that the plot might take 3 episodes to reach. It's over, isn't it? Full disclosure. Here comes a thought. Familiar. These are not filler. They're the show doing its clearest emotional work. I'll mention specific songs where they're relevant to the psychological territory we're exploring, not because this is a music analysis, but because the show itself uses music the way a therapist might use silence, to let things land without commentary. And it's a substantial body of work, just over 160 episodes of the original series, plus 20 episodes of the future epilogue, plus a film. Long enough that psychological arcs have actual room to breathe. This is different from a film, where character psychology has to be established efficiently. The show earns the complexity it eventually reveals because you've spent years with these people. When Amethyst eventually confronts her shame openly, it lands because you've watched it operate invisibly for seasons beforehand. When Steven's coping mechanisms fail in future, the failure feels earned because you've watched those mechanisms work for a very long time. The creative team was also notably collaborative on the psychological dimensions of the show. Rebecca Sugar has mentioned that several of the writers and crew drew from personal experience with the themes the show covers: grief, shame, identity, trauma, the exhaustion of being everyone's emotional resource. That gives a lot of the most precise moments a texture that you can feel is coming from somewhere real, even when you can't pin down exactly where. Something else about the show's structure that's relevant to its psychological accuracy: it develops slowly enough that character behavior has time to become habitual before it's examined. The first 2 seasons of Steven Universe are relatively light. They establish the characters, the world, the basic emotional dynamics. And they let Steven's patterns, the helpfulness, the emotional management, the instinct to make everyone okay, become familiar and even charming before they start interrogating them. By the time Future asks what it costs to be this way, We've watched those patterns operate for years. We know them. We've probably grown fond of them. And so, when the show starts to pull them apart, the discomfort is real because we've been complicit in reading them as simply virtuous. This is a more sophisticated narrative choice than it might appear. A lot of stories about mental health and emotional patterning introduce the problematic behavior as obviously problematic from the start. You're meant to see it as a flaw, track its consequences, watch the character learn to change. Steven Universe does something different. It presents the behavior as genuinely admirable for a long time, because within the context of the series, it is genuinely admirable. Steven's empathy saves lives. His diplomacy prevents wars. His refusal to give up on people produces real, meaningful change in the world around him. These are not rationalized virtues that secretly aren't working. They're genuine strengths. The show waits until future to ask, okay, but at what cost to the person doing it? And that question lands harder for having been held back so long. There's also a formal element here that matters. The show uses song in ways that are consistent with what therapists sometimes call narrative reprocessing. The idea that giving painful experiences a narrative form or an aesthetic form can create enough distance from the raw experience to allow it to be looked at. It's over, isn't it? Is Pearl looking directly at her grief in a way she can't sustain in ordinary dialogue. Here Comes a Thought teaches something practical about sitting with difficult feelings. Change Your Mind ends the original series by having characters sing themselves into their own autonomous existence. The musicality isn't decoration. It's the show's chosen method for doing the emotional work the plot can't quite reach. Murray Bowen was an American psychiatrist who, in the 1950s and 60s, developed what became family systems theory. The core idea is deceptively simple. You can't understand a person by looking at them in isolation. A person is always a node in a network. They're shaped by the emotional patterns of their family, and their behavior makes more sense when you understand the system they're embedded in. The family isn't just the backdrop to the individual's story. The family is part of the individual. That framing is a useful one for thinking about Steven, because his family is not straightforwardly a family. He has a father, Greg, who is human and present and genuinely loving. He has no mother in any living sense. Rose Quartz ceased to exist as a conscious being when Steven was born, though her influence on everyone around him is enormous, and we'll come back to that at length. And he has 3 ancient alien women who function as a combination of older siblings, surrogate parents, and something for which there isn't really a good English word, because nothing in human family structures quite maps onto it. Pearl, Amethyst, and Garnet are thousands of years old. They've been through a war, they've lost most of their friends, they're still processing grief that predates human civilization. And they're raising a child, or trying to, while all of that is going on underneath the surface. What makes the crystal gems an interesting family system is that they're not neglectful or malicious. They love Steven genuinely and visibly, but each of them brings their own developmental arrests, their own unresolved trauma, their own emotional blind spots into the household, and those things shape the environment Steven grows up in, whether anyone intends it or not. Pearl is preoccupied by her grief for Rose, which she can't fully express because she can't fully access it. Amethyst is managing her own deep shame about her origins, which makes her emotionally volatile in specific situations. Garnet is the most grounded of the 3, but she carries her own weight, her own secrets, her own things she doesn't talk about. Bowen had a concept called the undifferentiated family ego mass, the idea that in some families, the emotional boundaries between members become so blurred that individual members start absorbing each other's anxiety rather than processing their own. The gems aren't quite that, but there's a version of it. When Pearl is in crisis, the household absorbs her crisis. When Amethyst acts out, everyone adjusts around it. Steven, as the youngest and most emotionally attuned member of the system, ends up functioning as a kind of emotional regulator for the whole group, sensing when things are off, adjusting his own behavior to compensate, taking on responsibility for the emotional climate of the home in ways that no child should really need to. This isn't anyone's fault, exactly. It's the product of a system that was never designed to include a child and is doing its imperfect best to accommodate one. But the outcomes of that system are visible in Stephen's behavior from very early in the show. There's also the homeostasis problem. Bowen identified that families, like most systems, tend to resist change. Even when the current pattern is painful, it's familiar, and familiarity creates its own kind of stability. The crystal gems have a deeply embedded pattern. They handle the big external threats. Stephen provides warmth and emotional glue. Greg offers occasional human perspective from a comfortable distance. When anything disrupts that pattern, when Stephen pushes back, or when the nature of the threats changes, or when a Steven universe future arrives and the external threats disappear entirely, the system doesn't know how to recalibrate, and Stephen, who has built his entire identity around his role within that system, is the one who suffers most when it becomes obsolete. Greg is worth a note here because he sometimes gets undervalued in analyses of Stephen's psychology. He's not a gem. He doesn't have powers. He can't always follow the plot, so to speak. But he provides something none of the gems can. A model of ordinary human warmth. Of someone who loves Stephen without agenda, without projection, without the complicated weight of Rose's memory. The moments in future where Greg is the one who reaches Stephen, who says the right thing, who holds space without trying to fix anything. Those moments are not accidents. The show knows what Greg is for. There's also a specific dynamic worth naming around what Bowen called emotional triangles. When tension exists between two people in a family system, say Pearl and Amethyst, whose relationship is charged with a long history neither of them fully talks about, a third person often gets drawn in to manage or diffuse that tension. The triangle stabilizes the two-person relationship by redistributing the anxiety. Stephen is frequently the third point in these triangles. He mediates, he absorbs, he finds the bridge. This is not a unique or pathological thing in itself. Triangles are normal features of family systems. But when one person is consistently the circuit breaker for everyone else's tensions, they take on a disproportionate share of the relational load. And Stephen, because of his particular responsiveness to others and his deep-seated belief that his job is to make things okay, volunteers for that position almost reflexively. The episode Together Alone, which is set on Homeworld and involves a ball during which fusions keep happening in defiance of Diamond Law, uses the formal social world of Homeworld as a very transparent analogy for the exhaustion of navigating systems that demand emotional management from everyone at all times. Stephen has to hold the peace, monitor everyone's reactions, keep things from exploding, and somehow be okay while doing it. It's an episode about a diplomatic event. It's also an episode about what it feels like to be the person who can never just be in the room without working the room. One thing the show does quietly well is show how the crystal gems' collective emotional limitations don't map neatly onto blame. Pearl is not an inadequate caregiver because she's bad at caring. She's limited in specific ways because of what she went through, and she's working within those limits as best she can. The same is true of Amethyst, and of Garnet in her own way. This is an important distinction, both for how we understand the characters and for how the show models family dynamics more generally. Systems produce outcomes that no individual in the system chose. The blame frame, who was responsible for Stephen's situation, is less useful than the systemic frame. This is what happened given these specific conditions, and here is what it produced. There's a term in developmental psychology called parentification, and it describes what happens when a child takes on roles that are developmentally inappropriate, roles that belong to adults. It comes in two forms broadly. Instrumental parentification is when the child handles practical adult responsibilities, managing the house, looking after younger siblings, keeping the finances in order. Emotional parentification is when the child manages the emotional lives of the adults around them, serving as a confidant, smoothing over conflicts, keeping the peace, making sure the grown-ups are okay. Stephen is almost exclusively emotionally parentified, and it starts young. From early in the original series, you can see him operating as the emotional center of this crystal gem household. He reads the gem's moods, he adjusts his behavior to match what each of them needs in a given moment. He mediates when Pearl and Amethyst argue, which happens fairly regularly because their relationship has its own complicated history and neither of them is particularly good at talking about it. He brings Greg and the gems together when the distance between those two worlds grows awkward. He finds ways to make everyone feel valued and included even when the group is fractured. This would be impressive emotional intelligence in an adult. In a child who should be learning how to receive care as much as give it, it's a flag. There's an episode called Rose's Room that comes fairly early in the series and does something quietly devastating. Stephen has a room in the Crystal Temple that responds to his desires. It can generate anything he wishes for. He retreats to it after the gems are too preoccupied with a mission to spend time with him. The room gives him what he wants. A version of Beach City populated by simulation copies of his friends and family who say exactly what he wants to hear. It's obviously hollow, and he eventually escapes it. But the interesting psychological detail is why he retreated there in the first place. He didn't go because he was sulking or throwing a fit. He went because he could sense the gems were stressed and preoccupied. And he didn't want to add to that by expressing that he felt left out. He has already learned, at this age, that his feelings are a potential burden. He has already learned to manage them quietly rather than risk making other people uncomfortable. That's not a healthy thing to learn that early. The episode Mindful Education is a later one, and it handles this more explicitly. It's about Stephen and his friend Connie, who fuse together to form a being called Stevani. And Stevani keeps being destabilized by intrusive thoughts and memories. Garnet works through what's happening with them, and the conclusion is that Stephen has been suppressing difficult feelings, guilt, anxiety, things that happened in the past that he hasn't processed, because dealing with them, in the moment, would have disrupted the people around him who needed him to be okay. He's been carrying things quietly for so long that they've started to erupt. This is exactly what the research on emotional parentification predicts. Children who learn to manage adults' emotions often develop exceptional interpersonal skills. They're good at reading rooms, good at knowing what people need, good at de-escalating tension. They get praised for it, which reinforces the behavior. But the cost is that they don't develop the same literacy around their own inner experience. Their emotional intelligence flows outward by default. They get very good at knowing what everyone else is feeling and quite poor at knowing what they themselves feel, or believing that their feelings are worth attending to. Stephen's powers are a nice metaphor for this. When you look at them through that lens, he heals other people. His shield protects others. His primary abilities are oriented entirely toward the well-being of people who are not him. His own needs, physical, emotional, relational, are almost never what his powers respond to. The gems, to be clear, are not deliberately creating this dynamic. Pearl relies on Stephen for emotional support, largely because she has nowhere else to put her grief. Amethyst leans on their relationship because it's uncomplicated in a way that most of her other relationships aren't. Garnet trusts Stephen in a particular way, maybe because he reminds her of what she values most, or maybe just because he's genuinely easy to be around when things are stable. None of them sit down and decide to make him responsible for the emotional weather of the household. But that's rather the point. Parentification rarely happens through anyone's explicit decision. It happens gradually, through accumulated patterns of who is available, who adjusts, who absorbs, who manages. And in the Crystal Gem household, the pattern is clear. Stephen adjusts, Stephen absorbs, Stephen manages. He's extraordinarily good at it. And it costs him quietly in ways that don't become visible for years. The research literature on parentification consistently highlights a few downstream effects. One is what clinicians call affect dysregulation in reverse. Rather than not being able to regulate their emotions, parentified children often become so skilled at managing external emotional environments that their own internal regulation is stunted. They know exactly what to do when someone else is distressed. They have almost no framework for what to do when they themselves are distressed, partly because the distress has rarely been given room to exist in the first place. Another consistent finding is what might be called premature closure of the dependency period. Healthy child development requires a sustained period of being appropriately dependent, of needing things and having those things provided without the child being required to reciprocate or manage the giver's emotional state in return. When that period is shortened by parentification, the child doesn't have the experience of pure receiving that teaches them, on a visceral level, that their needs matter. Stephen has had warmth, care, genuine love from the people around him, but warmth given conditionally, even if the condition is just be the person who holds us together, is different from warmth given freely. He's had an enormous amount of the former and not quite enough of the latter. There's also the question of what Stephen learns about masculinity and emotional expression through this particular role. The show pushes back gently against the norm that boys shouldn't express emotion. Stephen cries openly, talks about his feelings, is never mocked for his sensitivity within the narrative. But his emotional expression is almost always oriented toward the other person's benefit. He cries when someone else is hurting and he wants to reach them. He expresses fear when he needs the gems to understand the stakes. His emotional life is deployed often in service of connection rather than simply as the expression of his own inner experience, which is perhaps a more subtle version of the same problem. The feelings are allowed, but they're still in service of the management role. The song Here Comes a Thought from the Mindful Education episode is worth a moment. It's ostensibly a meditation song, Garnet and Stephen and Connie singing about how to approach intrusive thoughts without being overwhelmed by them. But what the song is actually reaching for is something more specific. The idea that thoughts and feelings don't have to be managed or resolved immediately. They can just exist. You can notice them, and they don't have to become action. That's a profoundly different relationship to inner experience than the one Stephen has been living with, where every feeling is immediately converted into behavior, specifically helpful behavior directed outward. One more dimension of the parentification picture worth adding, the way it interacts with grief. There's a body of clinical work on what happens to children who experience loss when they're simultaneously the ones managing the family's emotional response to that loss. Bereavement researchers have found that parentified children in grieving families often end up with what's called complicated grief of their own, not because they're incapable of mourning, but because they never had the psychological space to do it. They were busy making sure everyone else was coping. Their grief gets deferred, then delayed, then eventually expressed sideways, as anxiety, as physical symptoms, as relational difficulty, because it never found a direct path out. Stephen lost Rose before he was born, which means he didn't experience her loss in the conventional sense. But he grew up inside the grief of people who did experience it, and he managed that grief as part of his household role. Pearl's grief, Amethyst's grief, even Greg's grief in its quieter form, these were things Stephen navigated around, accommodated, helped where he could. He became fluent in other people's mourning for someone he himself never had to mourn, because he never had her to lose. And then, in future, he discovers that what he actually lost was something different. The idealized mother image, the Rose Quartz of everyone's accounts, the figure whose goodness was the ground he stood on. That loss is his own. It's not borrowed from the gems. And it surfaces as his own grief, finally. At the worst possible time in the worst possible form, because there was never room for it before. Pete Walker is an American therapist who writes about complex trauma, and he popularized a 4-part framework for understanding trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Most people are familiar with the first 3. The fawn response gets less attention, possibly because it looks so much like kindness from the outside that it's harder to recognize as a coping mechanism. The fawn response is, essentially, the use of helpfulness and accommodation as a way of managing threat. The person who fawns learns, usually early, usually in response to an environment that felt unpredictable or unsafe, that the best way to stay okay is to make the people around them okay. If everyone is calm and satisfied and well taken care of, then there's no danger. So they help. They de-escalate. They smooth things over. They make themselves useful. They become the person everyone else turns to. And it works in the short term, which is why it persists. Stephen is a textbook fawn. This is not a criticism. It's an observation about what his environment required him to learn. His instinct in almost every conflict across almost every season is to find a way to make it right for everyone involved. He talks to the gems when they're in distress. He talks to gem villains who turn out not to be purely villainous. He talks to the diamonds, the most powerful authoritarian beings in the gem universe, and somehow manages to find a way through that doesn't involve direct confrontation. His method of problem solving is relentlessly empathetic. He almost always tries to find the emotional truth beneath the surface conflict and address that rather than the surface conflict itself. And again, this is genuinely admirable. It's also what makes Steven Universe Future so interesting, because Future is fundamentally the story of what happens when the fawn response runs out of threats to respond to. The series opens with the gem conflict resolved. Homeworld has changed. Beach City is safer than it's ever been. Steven has a little homeschool where reformed gems are learning to exist on Earth. He's doing good work. And he should, theoretically, be fine. But he's not fine. And the show is very careful to show you why. Without an external crisis to manage, Steven has no structure. His identity is built around the act of helping, the act of fixing, the act of being the person other people need. When there's no one who urgently needs his help, he goes looking for it. There's an early Future episode called Little Homeschool, where Steven attempts to help Jasper, a gem who has never been his friend, who actively doesn't want his help, and who has every reason to resent his presence, integrate into the school. He keeps pushing, he keeps trying. And the show is clear that this isn't entirely altruistic. Steven needs to help Jasper because he needs the role of helper. It's not about Jasper. It's about Steven having somewhere to put his energy. Later, in Bismuth Casual, Steven can't function at a casual social event because there's nothing for him to fix. He awkwardly circulates searching for a problem. It's played with some lightness, but the observation underneath is not light at all. There's also the boundary problem that tends to accompany fawn patterns, and Steven demonstrates it reliably. People with strong fawn tendencies often struggle to recognize when their helping is actually about their own emotional regulation, rather than the other person's genuine need. They help because not helping feels dangerous, because their nervous system has learned that their safety depends on keeping others satisfied. When someone declines their help, or when they're told that the help isn't wanted, it registers not as useful information, but as a kind of rejection or threat. You see this with Jasper. You see it with Bismuth. You see it most clearly in the episode Together Forever, where Steven proposes to Connie, who is 17 and about to go to college, essentially because he cannot bear the idea of their lives diverging. That's not really a proposal. That's a fawn response to perceived abandonment dressed up in romantic language. Rebecca Sugar has said in interviews that the show came out of her own relationship with these patterns, and that Steven's Universe Future was specifically about the experience of realizing that you've spent years making yourself useful to everyone and have very little sense of who you are when the usefulness is no longer required. That's a fairly specific thing to know about yourself. It took her making a 7-year-long television series apparently to get there, which honestly seems like a reasonable way to process it. Something else worth adding here about the fawn response. It can be quite difficult to recognize in yourself because it so consistently produces social rewards. Steven is beloved. He's the heart of every group he's in. People light up when he enters the room. The fawn pattern works, in the sense that it generates warmth and connection, and positive regard from others. The cost is almost entirely internal and entirely invisible from the outside. You look at someone like Steven and you see someone who is good at relating to people. You don't necessarily see someone whose nervous system has concluded that being indispensable is the price of being safe. There's a useful distinction from the therapeutic literature between helping from fullness and helping from depletion. Helping from fullness means you have enough, you're okay, and you're choosing to contribute some of that surplus. Helping from depletion means you're running on empty and giving anyway, often because the alternative, not helping, saying no, admitting you don't have it, feels psychologically dangerous. Most people who care about others do both at different times. Steven, in future, is very clearly doing the latter, and the show tracks the physical and emotional cost of that accurately. The Steven's Dream episode earlier in the series is an interesting early case study. Steven has persistent, distressing dreams about Pink Diamond's past and wants to investigate them. The gems try to stop him, not out of malice, but because they're worried. And his response is to sneak off and handle it himself, rather than create a conflict. That impulse, to absorb discomfort quietly, rather than advocate for his own needs in a way that might upset someone, is the fawn response working at a fairly low level. It's not dramatic. It's just a boy deciding his curiosity is less important than keeping the peace, and it happens in episode after episode in small ways throughout the whole run of the original series, until Future brings it to a head. John Bowlby was a British psychiatrist. The British connection is, in this case, incidental, but I'll take it, who developed attachment theory in the mid-20th century, largely out of his observations of children who had been separated from their parents. The basic idea is that humans are born with an attachment system, a biological imperative to form close bonds with caregivers, because close bonds with caregivers are what kept our ancestors alive. We come into the world wired to need and to reach for, and have become distressed when we can't find the person we've attached to. But Bowlby's real contribution wasn't just identifying that attachment exists, it was identifying that the quality of early attachment experiences shapes what he called the internal working model, the set of implicit beliefs and expectations that a person carries into every subsequent relationship. If early caregivers were consistently responsive, warm, and available, the child develops what's called secure attachment, a working model that says more or less relationships are safe, people can be trusted, it's okay to need things and ask for them. If caregivers were inconsistent or emotionally unavailable, the child develops various forms of insecure attachment, different strategies for managing the unpredictability of connection. Steven's attachment situation is unusual enough that it doesn't map cleanly onto standard attachment categories, which is part of what makes it interesting to think about. His mother is absent in the most absolute possible way. She gave up her physical form when he was born, and her conscious mind ceased to exist. He has no lived relationship with her. He has stories, images, an idealized narrative built from other people's memories of her. He has her gem, which sometimes provides access to things she experienced, but he never had Rose. He's attached to a ghost. His primary caregivers, the gems, are present and loving, but they're also emotionally preoccupied in ways that create intermittent unavailability. Pearl's grief for Rose makes her periodically unreachable in specific emotional registers. Amethyst's own self-worth issues mean she oscillates between warmth and defensive withdrawal. Garnet is the most consistent, but Garnet also keeps things close to her chest in ways that can feel opaque. What this tends to produce, in real children raised in similar emotional environments, not gem ones, is something close to anxious attachment, sometimes called preoccupied attachment in adults. The person becomes hyper-attuned to the emotional states of others because they learned early that other people's emotional states are the most reliable indicator of whether the environment is safe. They become very skilled at reading what others feel and quite anxious about whether they themselves are securely held. They often have difficulty believing that people will stay, even when all the evidence suggests they will. Steven shows this pattern with remarkable consistency once you start looking. His relationship with Connie is the clearest window into it, because Connie is probably the healthiest relationship he has. She's warm, honest, she calls him out when he's being unreasonable, she has her own life and ambitions outside of their friendship. By most measures, it's a genuinely secure relationship. And yet, when she decides to go to college, a normal developmental move, a completely reasonable choice that has nothing to do with Steven, he responds with what looks very much like attachment panic. The Together Forever proposal isn't a romantic gesture so much as a desperate attempt to prevent a separation he's interpreting as abandonment. The episodes in Future where friends start moving on, Lars goes to space, Sadie moves forward with her band, bismuth, and peridot, and lapis all begin building independent lives, function as a sustained stressor on Stephen's attachment system. Each one is a small version of the same terror. The people he loves are leaving, and there might not be a role for him anymore. And if there's no role for him, what is he? This is where the attachment history and the parentification narrative intersect, actually. One of the specific features of emotional parentification is that it can produce a child who doesn't know how to receive care, who is so practiced at giving it that accepting it feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar. There are moments scattered through the series where the Gems or Greg try to check in on Stephen to ask how he's actually doing, and he deflects. Not rudely, but smoothly. Changes the subject. Redirects towards someone else's problem. Reassures them that everything's fine. He's so good at managing the emotional environment that he can manage his own concealment within it almost invisibly. Greg is interesting in this context because he's probably the most straightforwardly secure attachment figure Stephen has. He's warm without agenda. He doesn't need Stephen to be anything other than his son. He's not processing grief for Rose through Stephen, or projecting a complicated history. He just shows up. The Growing Pains episode ends with Greg sitting with Stephen and saying something simple and entirely right. And it works precisely because Greg doesn't overthink it. He's just there. That's what secure attachment looks like in practice. Not grand gestures, just reliable presence. There's a fascinating episode called Full Disclosure, in which Stephen, immediately after a traumatic event involving homeworld gems and a near-death experience, decides to text Connie that they shouldn't be friends anymore. He doesn't want to drag her into the danger of his life. He's going to protect her from it by removing himself from her world. And he means this entirely sincerely. It's not manipulation, it's not cruelty. It's the attachment logic of someone who believes that people who get close to him will get hurt. That's anxious attachment, thinking at a fairly sophisticated level. It's not, you'll leave me, it's I need to leave you first for your own sake. The protective version of the same underlying belief that closeness is inherently dangerous. Connie's response to this, she finds him, confronts him, refuses the severance, is one of the moments where the show models healthy relational dynamics. She doesn't accept being pushed away. She demands the actual conversation. She treats his choice to withdraw not as something to respect at face value, but as something to challenge, because she can see that it's coming from fear rather than genuine preference. Connie as a character deserves more time than we have tonight. She is probably the healthiest person in Stephen's orbit. The one who consistently models what it looks like to have your own life, your own goals, your own sense of self, while also being deeply committed to a relationship. She doesn't erase herself to be with Stephen. She brings herself. And one of the things Future implies, without stating it directly, is that this has been quietly instructive for him. That watching someone exist with integrity as themselves has taught him something about what that might look like for him too, even when he couldn't do it himself yet. The attachment disruption around Rose specifically is worth dwelling on for a moment longer. Research on children who grow up with a deceased parent, particularly one who died in circumstances connected to the child's own birth, suggests that the nature of the loss creates specific complications for identity and attachment. There's survivor's guilt in some form, even in children too young to name it that way. There's the peculiar grief of mourning someone you never knew. There's the difficulty of forming an authentic relationship with someone who exists only in other people's accounts. Stephen has to grieve a mother who is also, in some sense, the reason he exists. Those are complex things to hold simultaneously, and the show doesn't rush or tidy them. And there's one more thing, which is about what it means to grow up as someone's continuation. Rose didn't just die. She transformed. She gave her physical existence to create Stephen. Her consciousness didn't persist, but her gem did, embedded in him, carrying whatever residue of her experience lived in that stone. He is not simply her child. He is, in some literal sense, what she became. That's an unusual form of loss for a child to navigate. The person I came from is not gone. Exactly. They are in me. They are the physical fact of me. And I still don't know them at all. Stephen's relationship to his own gem, the pink rose on his stomach, the source of his powers, the thing he shares with her, carries this weight. It's him and it's her, and there's no clean line between the two. Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist, proposed a sequence of 8 psychosocial stages that humans move through from infancy to old age, each characterized by a central tension or conflict that needs to be navigated. The 5th stage, the one that corresponds to adolescence, is identity versus role confusion. The task is to develop a coherent sense of who you are, your values, your direction, your place in the world. The failure mode is diffusion, remaining unsure of the self, borrowing identities from others, feeling unable to commit to a direction because you're not sure what you're committing as. Stephen's identity task is substantially more complicated than most adolescents face, and not only because he's technically part alien. From the very beginning of his conscious life, Stephen has been defined in relation to his mother. The gems knew Rose. They loved Rose. They're still grieving Rose. And Stephen carries her gem in his stomach, which means every time they look at him, there's a layer of that grief and that love and that memory in what they see. He's both himself and a reminder of someone else. That's a strange thing to grow up as. The early seasons show him navigating this in ways that are psychologically recognizable, even if the specifics are science fiction. He tries to fill Rose's shoes. He attempts to be what he imagines she would have been. Brave, compassionate, a leader, someone whose love for humanity was boundless and uncomplicated. There's even an early version of the show's theme song where his lyrics include the line, "I will fight to be everything that everybody wants me to be when I'm grown," which is not exactly the healthy adolescent identity formation you'd hope for, but it's honest about where he's starting. The psychological problem with building your identity around someone else's legacy is that the someone else is not you. Their values might not be your values. Their way of being in the world might not be yours. And when the two diverge, which they inevitably do because you are not them, there's a crisis. Either you suppress the divergence and keep pretending, or you confront it and risk losing the sense of self you'd constructed. Pearl's episode, It's Over, Isn't It?, is not a Stephen episode, it's Pearl's. But it illuminates Stephen's situation from the outside. Pearl sings about seeing Rose in Stephen's eyes, in his movements, in the shape of him. Every interaction is shadowed by who he isn't. He's carrying not just his own identity formation, but the weight of being someone else's echo, and the people who love him most are often the ones projecting that echo most powerfully onto him. The show builds toward this tension for several seasons before the identity crisis reaches its peak, which happens when the truth about Rose comes out. But before we get there, Stephen doesn't only perform Rose's legacy, he also sometimes actively resists it, in ways that are easy to read as rebelliousness, but are probably better understood as healthy differentiation. The moments when he decides not to follow the gem's plan, the moments when he finds his own solution, one Rose might not have chosen. The developing sense over the course of the series that he is Stephen, not Rose, not Rose's heir, not a continuation of someone else's story. That process is slow and nonlinear, as identity formation usually is. It gets complicated significantly by what happens in season 5, but the germ of it is there from early on, a kid trying to figure out who he is in a house that keeps pointing toward who he's supposed to be. There are moments scattered through the early series where you can see Stephen testing the edges of his own identity, finding where he is and where Rose is, and where the two diverge. In Lion 3, straight to video, he finds a tape that Rose made for him before he was born, a message from her to a person she would never meet. And his response to the tape is complicated, which the episode handles honestly. She tells him she wanted him to have all the things she never could. A human life, love, limitation, the whole experience of being mortal. She calls him a gift. She speaks with obvious love. And Stephen is moved by it, but the episode doesn't let him be simply comforted. because the tape also makes him feel vividly how much of her life was not about him at all. She had a whole existence before him. He is her ending, not her entirety. There's something there about the specific loneliness of being a person who exists in someone else's resolution. Not in their story, but as the punctuation at the end of it. That's a strange thing to grow up with. And the show takes it seriously. Erik Erikson also identified what he called the psychosocial moratorium, the period during adolescence when society implicitly gives young people some room to try on identities without those choices being permanent. It's the time for exploration without full commitment. Stephen doesn't really get this. By the time he's the age at which most adolescents are cautiously testing different versions of themselves, he's been fighting interstellar wars, navigating diplomatic crises, and being the emotional anchor for a household of traumatized ancient beings. The moratorium that should have given him room to figure out who he is gets compressed repeatedly by circumstance, and when future finally gives him something like peace, he doesn't know what to do with the space because he's never had it before. The song Familiar, from the Homeworld arc in Season 5, is one of the show's most psychologically transparent pieces. Stephen, having arrived at Pink Diamond's old quarters, recognizes the decor and the color palette and the aesthetic, because these are all things that found their way into his world through Rose. He feels at home in a room that was never his, in a place he's never been, because he is suffused with someone else's history. It's sung as something warm and a little melancholy, and it's a precise depiction of what it feels like to be so defined by inherited identity that someone else's room feels like yours. That's not a comfortable feeling, however gently the show frames it. There's a concept in developmental psychology sometimes called the looking glass self. The idea that we build our sense of identity partly from seeing ourselves reflected in others' responses to us. The people around us are mirrors, and over time we construct a self-image from what we see in them. For Stephen, almost every significant mirror in his life reflects someone else alongside him. Pearl sees Rose. The crystal gems see Rose's legacy. The homeworld gems see Pink Diamond. Even Greg, who loves Stephen most clearly as himself, carries memories of Rose that shape how he interprets his son. The only mirrors that show Stephen purely are Connie, who knew him before she knew the mythology, and perhaps Lion, the inexplicable pink lion who was Rose's and is now his, but who treats him with the uncomplicated loyalty of an animal that simply goes where it belongs. This is why the change your mind moment in the season finale lands so hard. Stephen, in the confrontation with White Diamond, stops performing for anyone's projection of him. He says clearly that he is neither Pink Diamond nor Rose Quartz. He is Stephen. He is made of their history, but he is not them. He exists forward, not backward. It's a moment of identity consolidation, Erikson's resolution to the identity versus role confusion stage, achieved under the most extreme possible pressure, which is both a testament to the character and a commentary on the fact that nobody should have to fight that hard just to be allowed to be themselves. The particular loneliness of Stephen's identity situation is something the show handles without over-sentimentalizing. He's surrounded by people who love him. He is, materially, very well cared for. And he is also, in a specific psychological sense, one of the only people in his world who is trying to construct an identity without a template for what he is. Half human, half gem, neither fully one community nor fully the other. Son of a revolutionary who was also a diamond, who was also a traumatized being doing her imperfect best. Heir to powers he didn't ask for, a legacy he can't put down, a war's worth of consequences he arrived in the middle of and has spent his entire childhood navigating. Building a self from all of that is a substantial task. The show's honest that he doesn't fully finish it by the end. He's just further along than he was. Season 5 of Steven Universe contains one of the more psychologically interesting plot twists in animated television, and that's A Single Pale Rose, the episode where Steven discovers that his mother, Rose Quartz, was not who everyone thought she was. The short version, for anyone who hasn't seen it, Steven goes inside Pearl's gemstone to find a lost phone, moves through layers of Pearl's memories, and eventually reaches the truth that the crystal gems never knew. Rose Quartz was not a rebel quartz who led a revolution and faked the death of Pink Diamond. Rose Quartz was Pink Diamond. She staged her own shattering, gave Pearl a command she couldn't speak of, took on the Rose Quartz identity permanently, and lived as a different person for thousands of years. The mother Stephen has been told about, the legendary revolutionary, the defender of Earth and humanity, she was also a diamond, one of the most powerful beings in the gem universe, who had previously been involved in the very colonization she claimed to oppose. From a purely narrative standpoint, it's an effective reveal. From a psychological standpoint, it's fascinating because of what it means for Stephen specifically. There's a body of research on what happens when children form idealized images of absent parents. And I do mean research, not just clinical intuition. Children who grow up without a parent, particularly when the absent parent died or disappeared rather than simply being elsewhere, often construct an internal image of that parent that fills in the gaps with idealization. The absent parent becomes, in the child's imagination, something close to perfect, fully loving, deeply good, uncomplicated in their virtue. This image serves a psychological function. Yes, it's easier to feel connected to a parent who was wonderful but gone than to a parent who was complicated and also gone. Stephen has constructed exactly this image of Rose. She loved humans. She sacrificed herself for him. She was brave and compassionate. The gems confirm this image, more or less, because their own grief and love for her has done similar work on their memories. Everyone around Stephen has been building the same cathedral. The A single pale rose reveal doesn't simply add complexity to Rose. It introduces genuine moral problem. Pink Diamond, before she became Rose, had a pearl, a different pearl than the one who is now Pearl, and was responsible for emotional harm to her. She was given a colony to run, which is to say the colonization and destruction of a planet's existing life. She made choices that had real consequences for real beings. She was not simply a misunderstood revolutionary. She was a powerful figure who caused genuine damage, including to people who loved her, before she found a way to become someone she preferred to be. Stephen's response to this information is one of the more psychologically realistic things the show does in the back half of its run. He doesn't have a single clean reaction. He tries, for a period, to become Pink Diamond for the homeworld gems, to fill that role because he thinks is what's needed. He feels shame about what she did, shame that's partially rational and partially displaced because he didn't do any of it. He defends her to people who criticize her. He has difficulty hearing the accounts of people she hurt. He cycles through the grief stages without landing cleanly in any of them. What he's dealing with is something psychologists sometimes call a loss of an idealized object. The moment when the internal image of someone important collapses because reality can't support it anymore. The grief that follows is real grief, even when the person was never fully known. You're mourning the version of them that lived in your imagination, which was never really them, but was the source of a great deal of meaning. Losing that image feels like losing the person twice, and the specific content of what he learns about Rose makes it harder. If she had simply been more complicated than he knew, that would be one thing. But he learns that the crystal of pain in Pink Pearl's face, a crack that literally cannot heal because the wound is psychological rather than physical, came from her. That the entity Spinel was abandoned in a garden for 6,000 years because Pink Diamond got bored and didn't want to play anymore. These aren't minor revelations. They're evidence of a pattern of behavior that is difficult to integrate with the loving, sacrificial mother he was told about. Stephen's explosive reaction in the future episode Volleyball, when Pink Pearl begins to talk about what happened to her, is the clearest sign of how unprocessed this remains. He literally cannot hear it. His body responds before his mind does. He shouts, his power flares, everyone flinches. And then, when he realizes what he's done, and who he's scared, the shame of it compounds everything. He reacted like her, like Pink Diamond. That particular horror doesn't get named explicitly in the episode, but it's legible. There's a broader point here about the show's treatment of moral complexity in beloved figures. A lot of storytelling, particularly children's storytelling, handles the revelation that a hero was flawed by either exonerating them entirely or condemning them wholesale. Steven Universe doesn't do either. It sits in the ambiguity. Rose was capable of extraordinary love and also capable of causing real harm, sometimes to the same people in the same relationship. She was not simply good. She was not simply bad. She was a being with significant, unresolved history doing the best she could with what she had. And the best she could was, sometimes, not good enough. This is uncomfortable to sit with, particularly because Steven has been shaped by the idealized version of her. But the discomfort is precisely the point. Real grief for real people requires tolerating their complexity. The version of a person that lives in our heads after they're gone is always partial. We tend to remember the love more than the failure, the warmth more than the carelessness. And when something forces us to revise that internal image, it doesn't just add information. It changes the nature of the relationship itself, retroactively, in ways that are genuinely disorienting. The episode Your Mother and Mine in Season 5 is interesting in this context. Garnet tells a group of gems the story of the rebellion and Rose's role in it, a heroic account, the version everyone has been carrying, and we, the audience, know at this point that it's incomplete. The episode lets both things be true simultaneously. The heroic account is genuinely part of the story, and it's not the whole story, and the gap between them is where Steven has to live. He can't unknow what he knows. He can't return to the simpler version. And he has to find a way to grieve both the idealized Rose he was given and the more complicated being who actually existed, without losing the parts of her legacy that he actually values and has built himself from. The Change Your Mind episode, the Season 5 finale, resolves some of this, but not by providing an answer. It resolves it by having Steven explicitly choose himself. The diamonds in Homeworld want him to be Pink Diamond. The crystal gems, in their complicated ways, want him to be Rose. And Steven, in the episode's climax, insists on being neither. He's Steven. That's enough. The episode frames this as a triumph, and it is. But choosing yourself when everyone around you has a specific expectation of who you should be is genuinely difficult, and the show knows it. The triumph is real. The difficulty that got him there is also real. Since we're spending time on her, it seems worth turning the lens on Rose herself for a bit. Because the psychological story of Steven Universe isn't only Steven's story. It is also, in many ways, the story of what Pink Diamond passed on to him. The patterns, the tendencies, the unresolved material that gets handed down through the closest thing gems have to a bloodline. Pink Diamond's early life, as pieced together through various episodes and revelations, reads like a fairly recognizable account of someone raised in an environment of emotional invalidation. She was the youngest of the diamonds, the least powerful, the least taken seriously. Her requests were denied repeatedly. She wanted to care for the life on Earth's surface. She wanted to be seen as someone whose opinion mattered. She wanted agency over her own colony in a way that went beyond the standard colonization mandate. The other diamonds, yellow, blue, white, weren't cruel to her exactly, but they were consistently dismissive. Her feelings were treated as childish inconveniences. Her perspective wasn't given real weight. This is a fairly well-documented developmental pattern in the literature on narcissistic injury. A person in early life whose emotional reality is repeatedly invalidated, who is told that their experiences and desires are incorrect or unimportant, often develops compensatory strategies. Sometimes that compensation looks like the grandiosity and entitlement associated with narcissistic personality. Sometimes it looks like the opposite, a kind of self-annihilation, a desperate search for an identity that the environment will accept. Pink Diamond did something closer to the second. She made herself someone new. Rose Quartz was, in the most literal possible sense, an escape from a self that the world had told her was wrong, and the freedom she found in that identity was real. The show is clear that Rose genuinely loved her life on Earth, genuinely loved Greg, genuinely valued what she'd built. It wasn't a performance all the way down. But the problem with escaping yourself is that the original self comes with you. The unresolved parts travel. There are glimpses in the show of the pink diamond who never fully went away. The intermittent, emotional explosiveness. The moment of rage that cracked Pink Pearl's face. The abandonment of Spinel, which reads less like malice and more like the careless self-absorption of someone who hadn't developed the capacity to consistently hold others in mind. The way Pearl was commanded to silence, using the full force of Diamond authority, which Pearl had trusted Rose had moved beyond. These aren't the actions of a villain. They're the actions of someone who had developed a new persona but hadn't fully integrated the healing that would have needed to accompany it. The intergenerational dimension is the part that matters most for Stephen's story. Trauma researchers have documented extensively the way that unresolved parental material gets transmitted to children, not always through dramatic events, often through subtler channels, the emotional patterns a parent establishes, the things they model, the ways they respond to distress, the internal working models they pass on. Rose gave Stephen her gem. She gave him her powers. She gave him probably some constitutional version of her temperament. And she gave him, less intentionally, the legacy of everything she hadn't finished working through. He's doing it on her behalf, in a sense. The show seems to understand this. The arc of Steven Universe Future is, among other things, Stephen attempting to process grief for a parent he never had, whose myth he was given instead of a person, and whose unresolved business is scattered across the people and the world around him in ways he has to encounter one at a time. There's also something worth naming about what the show does with Pink Diamond's explosive anger, her temper tantrums as they're called in the text. The cracked face of Pink Pearl is the most visible consequence of this, and Stephen, in future, begins to show signs of the same. His powers flare when he's overwhelmed. He shouts. He damages things. There are moments where the show draws the parallel carefully and uncomfortably. The thing he was always most afraid of inheriting, he is, in fact, inheriting. Not because he's bad or because biology is destiny, but because he has never had adequate support for processing the things that trigger the response. The anger comes from the same place Rose's anger came from, pain without a safe channel. Spinel is worth a mention here, briefly, even though her own story deserves more time than a paragraph. She is introduced in the Steven Universe film as a being who was left behind by Pink Diamond, told to stand still in a garden and wait for Pink to come back, who never did. She waited millennia. Her entire arc is about what abandonment does when you have no framework for understanding it. When the person who left was the whole world, and their leaving has no explanation and no resolution. She represents the unfinished business of Pink Diamond's carelessness made literal, made into a character with needs and grief and an enormous weapon. And she ends up eventually not cured exactly, but held, received, given something that can begin to repair the original damage. The show's treatment of her is compassionate without being sentimental, which is probably the right note. There's a thread through all of these unfinished stories. Spinel, Pink Pearl, the off-colors who were hiding underground, that forms a quiet commentary on the gem system's relationship to expendability. Homeworld's logic is that some beings matter and some don't, and the ones who don't can be left behind, shattered, hidden, put to uses they didn't choose. The psychological damage that logic creates is pervasive and deep. Almost every significant character in the show carries some wound that traces back to a system that decided at some point that their experience was not worth attending to. Pink Diamond's attempt to escape that system through becoming Rose was genuine and partially successful and also deeply incomplete, because she carried the system's logic inside her in ways she couldn't fully see. Stephen inherits the escape and the incompleteness simultaneously. The work he has to do, the work Future is about, is figuring out which parts of the inheritance serve him and which parts need to be put down. That's a very human problem. Framed in very alien terms, And the show handles it with more care and precision than most purely human stories manage. That's worth something. That's worth quite a lot, actually. Pearl is probably the crystal gem whose psychology receives the most sustained attention across the series, and there's good reason for that. She's one of the more psychologically dense characters in the show, and a lot of what's interesting about her overlaps with things that are interesting about Steven, because they both share the inheritance of Rose. Pearls in the gem universe are created to serve. That's their function as defined by Homeworld's caste system. They're companions, attendants, extensions of someone else's will. They're not supposed to have independent opinions or desires or identities. They exist in relation to a superior being. Pink Diamond's Pearl, the Pearl who is now simply Pearl, was created in exactly this mold, and her entire early sense of self was built around devotion to Pink Diamond. That's not a metaphor. That's her literal origin. The psychological concept here is what some clinicians call dependent identity, a sense of self that's constructed entirely through the prism of another person. It's most common in relationships where there's a significant power imbalance, and is most damaging when the relationship ends without the person having developed any sense of who they are outside of it. When Pink Diamond became Rose Quartz, Pearl's identity transitioned with her. Rose was her world. Full stop. When Rose died, Pearl lost not just a person she loved, but the organizing principle of her own existence. That's grief compounded by identity crisis, and it's a hard combination to navigate at the best of times. For Pearl, it's been compounded further by the fact that she can't fully talk about it. Rose's final command, as Pink Diamond, was for Pearl to never speak of what really happened. Pearl has been carrying that secret inside her gem for thousands of years, and carrying a secret that's central for that long does something to a person. Her grief in the series is unusually persistent and unusually complex. There's a song in the episode Mr. Greg, which is the Greg and Pearl episode, the one where they finally address their shared loss of Rose, called It's Over, Isn't It? And if you want a 4-minute psychological portrait of complicated grief, that's a remarkably good one. Pearl isn't just sad that Rose is gone. She's angry, and the anger has nowhere safe to go. She's been replaced, in a sense, by Greg and then by Steven, and she doesn't know what to do with the bitterness that comes up around that. She loved Rose in a way that might have been more than service, more than devotion, and she's never going to know what Rose felt in return. Not fully, because Rose is not available for that conversation anymore. The aversion to shapeshifting, revealed in A Single Pale Rose, is a specific, embodied dimension of Pearl's trauma. The reason she doesn't shapeshift, which she acknowledges early on as something she can technically do but doesn't, turns out to be because the last time she shapeshifted, she took Rose's form to fake a diamond's death, and then had to stand in the aftermath of that and live with it. That's a very specific thing to have in your body. The association between a physical act and an enormous traumatic event makes the act itself a trigger. It's a recognizable pattern, even if the specifics are unusual. Her arc across the series is, in the end, about individuation, the slow and uneven process of figuring out who she is when she's not defined by devotion to someone else. She has interests, she has passions, aviation, engineering, music, her friendship with Amethyst. She finds gradually ways to be in the world that belong to her, rather than being borrowed from Rose. It's not a clean arc. It has reversals and moments of backsliding, but it's honest about how that kind of work actually goes. There's a recurring visual motif with Pearl that I keep coming back to. She keeps things inside her gem. Literally, the gem on her forehead serves as storage for physical objects. But metaphorically, this has always struck me as the show's visual shorthand for Pearl's relationship to her inner life. She keeps things compressed, contained, tucked away where they can't cause immediate disruption. The phone that becomes the MacGuffin of A Single Pale Rose is, among other things, an object she couldn't retrieve herself. She needed Steven to go inside and find it for her. needed someone else to navigate the compressed memory she'd been carrying for thousands of years because she couldn't access it on her own without breaking the vow of silence. That's a fairly exact description of what prolonged repression does. It takes things you can't process and stores them somewhere below the reach of ordinary recall, and then they need unusual conditions to surface. The Season 4 episode Last One Out of Beach City is a smaller, lighter episode that's nevertheless important to Pearl's arc. She goes to a concert with Amethyst and Steven. She tries to be spontaneous and casual. She ends up in a low-stakes adventure that involves a minor road trip and meeting a stranger who looks uncannily like Rose. And for a brief moment, she's just Pearl. Not Rose's Pearl. Not the traumatized survivor of the Gem War. Not the keeper of unspoken secrets. Just a being who likes music and has terrible taste in parking, and is, very tentatively, becoming herself. It's one of the gentler episodes in the whole run, and I find it more affecting in some ways than the explicitly heavy ones. There's also the Sworn to the Sword episode, where Pearl trains Connie and the training turns out to be entangled with Pearl's own grief. She's teaching Connie to be a defender of Steven, a sword arm, someone whose own safety matters less than the person she's protecting. Steven is horrified by this and confronts it. The exchange that follows is one of the clearer articulations in the show of what codependent service looks like from the inside. Pearl genuinely believes this is what love requires. She has spent so long building her identity around protective devotion that she's teaching it to a child as though it's wisdom. It's not cruelty. It's the only map she has, and it's limited in ways she hasn't fully recognized yet. One of the more underrated things the show does with Pearl is track the way her emotional vocabulary expands over time. Early Pearl is precise and controlled and a little brittle. She speaks in organized, complete sentences. She presents things in the correct order. She has a formality to her emotional expression that keeps everything slightly at arm's length. As the series progresses, she becomes more fluid, more willing to be caught off guard, more capable of expressing something imprecise and confused rather than only what she can articulate cleanly. That's character growth through writing craft. You can watch someone's psychological flexibility increase across seasons of animation, which is a fairly unusual thing to be able to observe. The question of what Pearl wants, not what she's devoted to, not what she's trying to achieve, but what she personally desires for herself, takes most of the series to even become a question she can hear. When it does become audible, it's via music, as is often the case in this show. The fragment of longing expressed in "It's Over, Isn't It?" is one of the first moments where Pearl is allowed to want something clearly and openly, and without it immediately being resolved or redirected. She's not asking for it, she's not planning for it, she's just acknowledging that it exists. That's progress, and the show is quiet about it in the way that real progress often is. Amethyst is in many ways the comic relief of the crystal gems, and the show is pretty honest about the fact that this is a coping mechanism. She jokes. She eats things she doesn't need to eat. She shapeshifts into random things for the fun of it. She sprawls around and refuses to take things seriously when seriousness is called for. She is, on the surface, chaotic and untroubled. Underneath that, she's carrying something that several episodes peel back with real care. A deep, foundational shame about her own existence. The context: Amethyst was created in the Prime Kindergarten, an Earth-based gem production facility during the war. But the war ended before she emerged. By the time she came out of the ground, everyone was gone. She spent years alone, with no knowledge of what she was or what she was supposed to be. And when she finally found the crystal gems, the first real information she got about herself was that she was defective. Too small, wrong size, a kindergarten that had already taken too much from the earth and produced her as a kind of final error. This is a specific kind of origin story, learning that you arrived wrong. Not that you did something wrong, but that your very existence is a mistake. That the universe would have been better arranged without you in it. Brené Brown's research on shame emphasizes the distinction between guilt, which says I did something bad, and shame, which says I am bad. Guilt is correctable, discourse. You can make amends, you can do better. Shame is not, because there's nothing to correct. You can't fix being. You can only try to outrun it. Amethyst's behavior patterns read quite clearly as strategies for managing exactly that shame. The counterdependence Rebecca Sugar described, the refusal to need authority, to acknowledge that any rules apply to her, is a way of preempting rejection. If you reject the system before it can reject you, the sting is on your terms. The eating, the shape-shifting, the chaotic energy, the jokes, these are ways of filling space and generating response from others without ever being still enough that anyone can see the thing underneath. The episode On the Run is the clearest explicit treatment of this. Stephen and Amethyst run away together for a day, ostensibly for fun, and end up at the prime kindergarten. And the holes in the ground, the places where gems like Amethyst came out of, leaving the earth depleted and scarred, affect her visibly. This is where she came from. This is the evidence of what she is. And Pearl, who follows them and means well, says exactly the wrong thing in exactly the wrong way, which triggers an explosion that has clearly been building for a long time. The tension in Amethyst's arc is between the shame that tells her she's not enough and the slowly accumulating evidence that she is, in fact, enough. Stephen versus Amethyst is another episode that handles this well. Both of them feeling inadequate in different ways, both of them working through it by first competing with each other and then, eventually, just talking. Amethyst has to learn that being different from what Homeworld intended doesn't mean she's wrong. She was shaped by Earth and by the crystal gems and by her own personality. She's exactly what she is. That sounds simple. It takes the whole series for her to find any traction on it. Jasper complicates this significantly. Jasper is what an ideal quartz looks like. Enormous, powerful, hardened. She came from the same kindergarten as Amethyst, which makes her, in a strange way, a kind of shadow self. When Jasper refers to Amethyst dismissively, when she compares them unfavorably, it activates something that has nothing to do with Jasper and everything to do with Amethyst's relationship to her own worth. The show is thoughtful about this. Jasper is not shown as simply right, but Amethyst's reaction to her is not simply wrong either. It's the particular pain of hearing someone else articulate the exact criticism you've been directing at yourself. The episode Tiger Philanthropist is a lighter one. Amethyst has been wrestling in a local circuit under a persona called Purple Puma, and at a certain point she just decides to stop, because she's got enough from it. The decision is small and undramatic, and that's precisely what makes it meaningful. She doesn't need the persona anymore. She doesn't need the outlet in the same way. She's comfortable enough in her actual self that the constructed identity loses its urgency. That's a small moment of genuine growth, and the show treats it exactly that lightly. No fanfare. Just a person who used to need a mask and has grown to need it a little less. The shape-shifting dimension of Amethyst's character is also worth a psychological note. Gems shape-shift for various reasons, but Amethyst does it compulsively, frivolously, constantly. She'll become a different thing seemingly on a whim. This reads, initially, as just part of her chaotic energy. But it also works as a metaphor for someone who doesn't feel fully settled in their own form. If you can be anything, you don't have to commit to being something specific. Shape-shifting as perpetual possibility rather than permanent self. The episodes where Amethyst holds her own form, where she just exists as herself without converting into something else for comic relief or deflection, are often the episodes where she's at her most psychologically present. There's also a worthwhile reading of Amethyst and Pearl's dynamical through the lens of complementary defenses. Pearl's defense is perfectionism and rigidity. Control everything, follow the rules, meet the standard. Amethyst's defense is chaos and rebellion. Reject the standard, break the rules, perform not caring loudly enough that no one asks whether you actually care. They irritate each other partly because they're each a mirror of the thing the other is running from. Pearl sees in Amethyst someone who's given up, which touches Pearl's own fear of inadequacy. Amethyst sees in Pearl someone who's tied themselves to a system that demands impossible standards, which touches Amethyst's own wound about not meeting standards. Their bickering, across the whole run of the show, is two people prodding each other's tenderest places without quite knowing that's what they're doing. Their eventual closeness, in later seasons, is two people slowly figuring out how to let each other be without it threatening their own sense of self. Garnet is the most stable crystal gem, and the show eventually explains why. She's not one gem, she's two. Ruby and Sapphire, who met during a crisis on Homeworld and fused, an act so taboo in gem society that it was grounds for serious punishment, and never stopped. Garnet is their relationship made manifest and sustained indefinitely. This is a wonderful piece of speculative world building, and it's also a fairly rich psychological metaphor depending on how you want to read it. The show has always been fairly explicit that gem fusion, particularly romantic fusion, is an analogy for intimate relationships, what it means to let someone else become part of how you move through the world, and what kinds of relationships produce healthy versus unhealthy versions of that blending. The episode The Answer, which tells the origin story of Ruby and Sapphire's fusion, frames it in terms of radical acceptance. Sapphire is a future-seeing gem of high status, who was supposed to witness a specific event. Ruby, her assigned guard, interferes accidentally and fuses with her in the confusion. What should have been catastrophic becomes instead a moment of recognition. Ruby and Sapphire are simultaneously themselves and something new, and the something new is better than either was alone. What Garnet represents, psychologically, is integration, the Jungian idea that psychological health comes not from eliminating one's contradictory aspects, but from holding them in relationship. Ruby's emotional intensity without Sapphire's perspective becomes impulsive and reactive. Sapphire's cool detachment without Ruby's warmth becomes remote and static. Together, they're Garnet, grounded, empathetic, capable of both feeling and thinking without either consuming the other. The countermodel is Malachite, the fusion of Lapis and Jasper. They fuse in a crisis, and Lapis immediately takes control of the fusion not as liberation, but as a trap. She holds Jasper in place at the bottom of the ocean, sacrificing her own freedom to contain someone she considers a greater threat. Two beings locked together by mutual damage, rather than genuine connection. The result is unstable, anguished, and ultimately self-destructive. The show calls this out explicitly. Malachite is what fusion looks like when it's built on trauma and control, rather than understanding and consent. Garnet's specific role in Stephen's life is worth a note here. She's his most consistent authority figure, in many ways his most reliable source of parental stability. She doesn't project Rose onto him the way Pearl does. She doesn't have the same shame dynamics as Amethyst. She's often the one who delivers difficult truths in ways that Stephen can actually receive, because she does it without judgment and without making it about her. The episode Keystone Motel shows what happens when Garnet falls apart, when Ruby and Sapphire are in conflict and Garnet temporarily unfuses, and the effect on Stephen is notable. He goes looking for her, distressed in a way that's out of proportion to the practical situation. Her stability is part of his stability. When she's unavailable, the floor shifts. The Garnet arc that unfolds through Season 5 and into Future, around the revelation of Homeworld's history and what the Diamonds did, is interesting because it's one of the few times we see Garnet genuinely uncertain. Sapphire, who can see the future, has been using that ability as a comfort. It'll all work out, in ways that Ruby has experienced as dismissiveness toward her present suffering. That's a subtle and very recognizable relationship dynamic. One person managing their anxiety through optimism, the other person needing validation for current pain that the optimism skips over. Working it out between them is, like most relationship work, slow and imperfect and worth the effort. There's an additional dimension to the fusion metaphor that I find genuinely interesting, which is what the show implies about how relationships change you. The idea that a healthy fusion produces something neither component could be alone isn't just about romantic partnership, though it's clearly about that too. It's about all forms of meaningful connection, friendship, chosen family, collaboration. When the show depicts Stevonnie, the fusion of Stephen and Connie, it's not depicting a romantic ideal so much as a psychological one. Two people who genuinely know each other, who have worked through conflict and reached understanding, and whose combination produces something more capable and more joyful than either would be separately. The contrast with the bad fusions in the show is instructive. Malachite, as I mentioned, jasper and lapis locked together by mutual damage. But there's also the cluster, buried beneath the earth, thousands of gem shards forcibly fused together, an abomination created through homeworld's cruelty, existing in constant agony. If healthy fusion is the show's image of what good relationships can be, forced and compulsory fusion is its image of what happens when people are bound together not by choice but by power. That's a fairly clear and useful moral geometry. Garnet's specific parenting of Stephen, because she does parent him in her way, tends toward the model of giving him accurate information and trusting him to handle it, while being consistently present when he can't. She doesn't overprotect him. She doesn't flood him with reassurance that everything will be okay. She tells him things she thinks he can handle and sits with him through the things that are hard. That's a style of parenting the research would broadly endorse, not shielding children from difficulty, but accompanying them through it. The difficulty of Garnet's approach is that it sometimes reads as withholding. She keeps secrets. She has things she doesn't say. But when she does speak, what she says tends to be exactly what Stephen needs to hear, and she has an unusual ability to deliver hard truths in ways that he can actually receive. That's a skill, and the show respects it. There's also a dimension to the ruby and sapphire dynamic that reflects something interesting about how complementary emotional styles work in practice over time. Sapphire's future sight gives her a baseline of calm that Ruby doesn't naturally have. Ruby's emotional immediacy gives Sapphire access to the present moment in a way her long view can obscure. They work because they're different in ways that compensate rather than clash, but this only works as long as both parties can trust that the other's different way of processing is as valid as their own. The Season 5 conflict between them is about that trust fraying. Sapphire's "it'll all work out" starts to feel to Ruby less like comfort and more like dismissal, because Ruby needs someone to acknowledge the present pain, not just the eventual resolution. That's a recognizable dynamic in any close relationship, where one person is more future-oriented and the other more present-oriented. The future-oriented person often reads the present-oriented person as catastrophizing. The present-oriented person often reads the future-oriented person as avoidant. Neither is wrong exactly. Both are seeing something real. The repair, when it comes in Maid of Honor, involves Sapphire acknowledging that Ruby's emotional reality in the present is as real as her vision of the future, and Ruby acknowledging that Sapphire's calm isn't dismissiveness, it's another kind of love. That's good relationship writing, and it's applicable well beyond animated aliens. The proposal scene, Ruby and Sapphire deciding to formalize what they already are, just for the joy of choosing each other clearly, is one of the show's warmest moments, and it earns its warmth by having made their relationship feel real, rather than simply sweet. In the 1990s, Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Anda ran what became one of the most significant studies in public health, the AC study, conducted with Kaiser Permanente in California. They asked over 17,000 adults about 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, domestic violence, substance abuse in the household, mental illness in the household, parental separation, and parental incarceration. Then they tracked those adults' health outcomes over time. What they found was striking and consistent. ACEs accumulate. Each additional adverse experience increases the statistical risk for a range of health problems: depression, anxiety, substance abuse, heart disease, and more. Someone with 4 or more ACEs had dramatically elevated risk compared to someone with 0. And the dose-response relationship was clear. More ACEs meant worse outcomes across almost every measure. The episode Growing Pains in Steven Universe Future uses this framework explicitly. Steven ends up in a medical examination with Dr. Maheswaran, Connie's mother, who is a doctor, after his body starts behaving in ways he can't control. Glowing pink, swelling, shape-shifting involuntarily. She examines him, finds evidence in his skeleton of healed fractures and injuries he doesn't remember receiving, and asks him about his childhood. And then she sits with him while he lists, almost casually, the things that happened to him: being attacked by a corrupted gem, nearly drowning while trapped with Connie, losing control of his body, almost dying of old age, watching Amethyst nearly die, watching Pearl get poofed, temporarily destroyed, watching Garnet be forcibly separated, being kidnapped and imprisoned in space. And that's the early stuff, by his own accounting. Dr. Maheswaran's conclusion is that Stephen's body has been under such sustained and extreme stress that it can no longer distinguish between major and minor threats. His nervous system, she explains, reacts to small inconveniences as though his life is in danger, because his life has been in danger so many times that that's what stress feels like. The cortisol response, designed for acute emergencies, has been running chronically. The window of tolerance, the range of arousal within which a person can function normally, has narrowed to almost nothing. This is one of the core mechanisms in PTSD, when the nervous system has been trained by repeated trauma to stay in high alert. Small provocations can push a person out of their functioning range entirely, triggering survival responses that would be appropriate in genuine danger. From the outside, the reactions look disproportionate. From inside the nervous system, everything is an emergency because everything has been an emergency. What makes Growing Pains remarkable, and I mean this genuinely, not just as praise for a cartoon, is that it gives this experience accurate language and presents it without sensationalism. Dr. Maheswaran is not alarmed in a way that makes it dramatic. She's concerned in a way that's caring and clinical. She uses ACEs not as a clinical trick, but as a framework for helping Stephen understand that what his body is doing makes sense. It's a normal response to an abnormal amount of sustained difficulty. That's a profoundly different message than "you're broken." It's closer to "you're not broken, you're injured," and that's a different thing. The physical manifestations of his trauma throughout Future, the pink glow, the uncontrolled growth, eventually the full monstrous transformation, are the show's visual metaphor for what happens in the body when the emotional experience can no longer be contained in the mind. Van der Kolk's work on trauma is relevant here. The body keeps the score. Stephen's gem body, which responds to emotional state with physical change, makes this quite literal. When his mind can't hold the distress anymore, his body begins to speak it. Something else to add here. Stephen never went to a doctor before Growing Pains. He heals so efficiently, his powers repair physical damage almost immediately, that there was never any obvious need. But efficiency of physical healing and psychological healing are entirely separate processes, and the show knows this. The X-ray image of his skeleton, full of evidence of healed fractures, is a quietly devastating image. A body that has been damaged over and over and repaired itself each time, without anyone ever asking how it was managing, without anyone ever recognizing that the repairs didn't extend to what was underneath the physical. There's a line in the episode where Dr. Maheswaran says something to the effect that sometimes the body holds trauma that the mind has been too busy to process. This maps directly onto what dissociation researchers observe in people with complex trauma histories: the tendency for the body to encode and store the emotional residue of experiences that the conscious mind moved past too quickly. Stephen has been in crisis after crisis since early childhood. There was never time to process one event before the next arrived. The experiences accumulated without resolution, and his body carried the weight of the accumulation in the form of healed but unprocessed damage. The pink glowing is the most visible symptom. The underlying cause is years of stored, unmetabolized experience finally demanding acknowledgement. The AC framework also helps contextualize why Future's low-level stressors feel so catastrophic to Stephen. If your system has been calibrated to treat stress as life-threatening, then the emotional equivalent of a friend moving to a different city registers at the same physiological level as a diamond attack. The threat detection system can't distinguish. It just knows danger. That's not dramatic or irrational. It's the predictable outcome of the ace load he's been carrying for his entire life. There's a detail in Growing Pains that tends to go unremarked. When Dr. Maheswaran shows Stephen his x-ray and points out the healed fractures, evidence of physical trauma, that his gem powers repaired without anyone noticing, Stephen's first response is to apologize. He says something to the effect of, "Sorry, I didn't know," as though the damage were his fault. As though the appropriate response to finding out your body has been sustaining and quietly fixing serious injuries since childhood is contrition. That reflects the instinct to take responsibility, to feel guilty about being hurt, is a recognizable feature of the fawn response in a medical context. He has been trained by a very long time of absorbing difficulty quietly, to read his own suffering as a problem he's caused rather than a problem he's experienced. Dr. Maheswaran's response, reassuring, non-judgmental, redirecting toward information rather than blame, is exactly right. It's a small moment. It's the episode doing its work carefully in the margins. There's a clinical concept called decompensation that's worth introducing here, because it describes what Future is essentially about. Decompensation is the process by which the coping mechanisms that have been keeping a person functional begin to fail. It often happens not during the crisis, but after it, once the immediate threat has passed and the psychological resources that were holding everything together are no longer being fueled by urgency. Steven Universe. Future opens in a period of relative peace. The gem conflict is resolved. Homeworld is reforming. The diamonds are trying to do better. Beach City is safer. And Stephen has, for the first time in his conscious life, a situation in which there is no clear and present emergency. Nothing to solve. Nothing to protect against. Just the ordinary work of being alive. This is when he starts to fall apart. The psychological logic of this is counterintuitive but well documented. During sustained crisis, people often hold together remarkably well. Adrenaline, dissociation, the sheer necessity of functioning keep things moving. The grief, the terror, the accumulating weight of it gets filed away somewhere. And then, when the crisis ends, when the necessity lifts and there's finally room to feel what couldn't be felt during the emergency, it comes out. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. Stephen's PTSD in Future manifests across multiple episodes before it's explicitly named. The avoidance dimension shows up early. His increasingly fraught relationship with anything connected to Pink Diamond. His inability to hear about what she did without his powers flaring. This is avoidance of trauma triggers. The mind trying to manage intrusive content by shutting the door before it opens. But the door keeps being opened because Pink Diamond's legacy is everywhere around him. The hypervigilance and irritability dimension is clearest in episodes like Bluebird, where a combination of two antagonist gems shows up on his doorstep essentially to mess with him, and his response escalates far beyond what the situation technically warrants. His threat detection is miscalibrated. Something that's annoying registers as dangerous, something that's mildly uncomfortable registers as intolerable. The window of tolerance Dr. Maheswaran described, already narrowed by his ACE history, has narrowed further. The negative cognition dimension is subtler but consistent. The growing sense that he doesn't matter now that the crisis is over, that his value was always instrumental rather than intrinsic, that the people around him are doing fine and moving forward, and he alone is stuck. This is not an accurate read of his situation, but it's a recognizable feature of the depressive cognition that often accompanies PTSD, and the show depicts it with precision. What's interesting about the Future arc, and what I think distinguishes it from simply being a sad season, is that it's specifically about the cost of the fawn response running dry. Stephen's coping strategy throughout the series has been, as we talked about earlier, to manage everyone else's emotional reality. That strategy worked as long as there was always someone who needed managing. In Future, with the peace achieved, the people around him are doing something he doesn't know how to do. They're just living, and Stephen doesn't know how to just live. He doesn't have the skill set for it. So he manufactures crises to manage, tries to help people who don't need his help, and eventually starts manufacturing crises that are actually internal. His own distress expressing itself in physical and relational terms because he has no other channel for it. the transformation into a monster in I Am My Monster, is the show's most explicit statement about what happens when all of the coping mechanisms fail at once. He becomes the thing he has spent his life fighting. He becomes the kind of gem creature that the crystal gems have been containing and trying to heal all along, which is, among other things, a quietly devastating piece of dramatic irony. The boy whose whole identity was organized around healing others has to become the thing that most urgently needs healing before anyone, including him, can face it clearly. There's a specific episode in Future called Guidance that's an early warning sign of where things are heading. Stephen has taken on a mentoring role at the little homeschool, helping reformed gems find jobs in Beach City. He's good at it. He reads what each gem is suited to, matches them to roles, makes the placement. But his method is entirely based on his own read of what each person should be, without much genuine collaboration with the gem in question about what they actually want. He's helping, but the help is directive rather than supportive. He's managing people rather than empowering them. When this is pointed out to him, he doesn't immediately receive it well. This is the savior pattern beginning to buckle under its own weight. Real support of another person's growth requires accepting that your read of what they need might be wrong, and that their own sense of what they need is primary data. Stephen has always been exceptional at reading others. He's less practiced at deferring to them. The difference between empathizing with what someone feels and overriding their own judgment with your intuition about what they should be is subtle, but it matters. And Stephen is starting to collapse the two. The depressive cognition that builds through Future is worth naming as a distinct element from the PTSD symptoms, because they often travel together, but they're not identical. Depression has a specific cognitive signature: a negative view of the self, a negative view of the future, a negative view of the present environment. And Stephen develops all three in fairly short order. He starts to believe his value was always instrumental, that people liked having him around because he was useful rather than because he was Stephen. He starts to believe the world has moved on and left him behind. He starts to believe his relationships are more fragile than they are, that any disappointment will break them. None of this is accurate. It's also not irrational, which is what makes depression particularly hard to argue your way out of. The beliefs feel like clear-eyed observation, not distortion, and he keeps it to himself, which is the other thing depression tends to do: make its own concealment seem necessary. The episode Mr. Universe. I mean the general thread of Stephen constructing an identity around his father's old musician persona as a kind of escape hatch in Future is worth a brief note. When things get uncomfortable, there's a pull toward a version of himself that has a clear script. The rockstar son of Greg Universe, the one with the van and the freedom and the uncomplicated human life. It's a fantasy identity, and the show knows it. But it's also a comprehensible wish, to be someone whose story is simpler, whose powers don't express as physical crisis, whose mother wasn't also a diamond with a complicated legacy and a series of people she hurt. In Future, Stephen starts to live in a state of collapsed regulation, swinging between hyper-arousal and hypoarousal with very little equilibrium in between. That narrowed window Mahaswaran described in Growing Pains has effectively closed. Episodes like Bluebird show the hyper-arousal end. Excessive vigilance, overreaction, difficulty coming down from a heightened state, and episodes like In Dreams show the hypoarousal end, flatness, withdrawal, using the adventure of someone else's dream as a way to avoid any direct contact with his own inner experience. Both are recognizable manifestations of the same underlying dysregulation. The show doesn't use these terms, but it depicts the pattern accurately. What makes the Future arc function so well as a psychological portrait is that it never feels punishing. The show isn't presenting Stephen's deterioration as a moral failure or a consequence of something he did wrong. It's presented as the natural, almost inevitable outcome of a set of circumstances, the particular childhood he had, the particular role he took on, the particular absence of adequate support for processing what he went through. The question the show asks is not, what's wrong with Stephen, but rather, what happens to someone like this, given conditions like these without intervention? The answer is this. And the answer to what changes it is being genuinely held by people who aren't asking him to be okay. The savior complex is one of those psychological terms that gets used loosely in common conversation, often in a way that's mildly pejorative. Someone is told they have a savior complex as a shorthand for being patronizing or self-aggrandizing. But the clinical reality of it is more interesting and more sympathetic than that framing suggests. At its core, the savior pattern is a form of codependency, deriving one's sense of worth, safety, and identity from the act of helping others. It's not primarily about wanting to be admired. It's about needing the role. The helper who operates from a savior complex is not, usually, fully aware that their helping is about their own emotional regulation as much as anyone else's genuine need. They experience themselves as motivated by care, and the care is often real. But underneath it, there's a more urgent driver. If I'm not helping, I don't know who I am. Stephen fits this pattern across the full run of the series, but Future isolates it most clearly by removing the conditions that made it functional. When the gem conflict was ongoing, there was always someone who genuinely needed his specific kind of help. The savior pattern was useful. Actually useful, not just emotionally useful. He was, concretely, the person who could bridge worlds and talk to enemies and find the emotional solution that force couldn't reach. The pattern and the circumstances were in alignment. In Future, the circumstances shift. The savior pattern doesn't shift with them. So you get Stephen attempting to help Jasper, who doesn't want help and is in fact made worse by his attempts. You get him disrupting the school's process with reformed gems because he thinks he knows better than the process what each gem needs. You get the little graduation episode, where friends moving forward with their lives sends him into a crisis that he tries to manage by attempting to hold everything in place. The boundary problem is central to all of this. Someone operating from a genuine savior pattern tends to struggle with the distinction between this person needs help and I need to help this person. They can look very similar from the outside and they can feel identical from the inside. The difference is in whose need is driving the intervention. When it's your need, when the urgency is internal rather than external, the helping tends to overstep, to push past where the other person is, to refuse the word no because no is experienced as abandonment rather than information. There's also a dynamic that family systems theorists call the identified patient problem, which is relevant here. In some family systems, one person unconsciously takes on the role of carrying the group's distress, becoming the problem, the one with the issues, the one who needs to be managed, as a way of keeping the group together. Stephen is not exactly this, but there's a version of it in the later Future episodes where his deterioration becomes, paradoxically, a way of returning the family to its familiar structure. He's in crisis. They're caring for him. Everyone has a role again. The homeostasis is briefly restored by his collapse. Rebecca Sugar has spoken publicly about writing this arc from personal experience, the recognition that she had spent years being extraordinarily useful to the people around her, and had gotten so good at managing others' well-being that she had almost entirely lost access to her own. The savior pattern in Stephen is not a critique. It's an honest portrait of what that pattern looks like from inside it, and what it costs the person who's built their life around it. There's a secondary cost to the savior pattern that the show captures, and that's worth naming separately. The way it can distort relationships without either party fully noticing. When your value in a relationship is primarily functional, you help, they receive help. The relationship doesn't have much room for your own vulnerability, your own need, your own imperfection. You become functionally the strong one. And that role is seductive in its clarity. But it also means that the people who care about you are being kept at a distance from the real you. They know the helper. They don't necessarily know the person underneath. Stephen, for much of the series, is known and loved primarily as the person who shows up and fixes things. The Stephen who doesn't know what he wants, who is frightened, who has grief he can't articulate, that person is considerably less visible. There's a moment early in Future that I keep coming back to, which is the opening of the very first episode. Stephen is giving a tour of the little homeschool, showing a prospective student around, being warm and enthusiastic and capable. Everything looks good. And then when the tour ends, he returns to his house alone and sits in the quiet, and there's a moment where the camera just holds on him, not doing anything, not helping anyone, just existing. And his face in that moment is not happy. It's not distressed exactly. It's blank, in the specific way of someone who has no idea what to do with themselves when there's nothing to do. That's the cost of the savior pattern, right there, in about 4 seconds of animation. They got it right. The irony the show builds toward is that the very quality that made Stephen exceptional as a hero, his ability to find the empathetic solution to see what others need and meet it, is also the quality that, without support and boundaries and a genuine sense of his own interiority, becomes the mechanism of his own damage. He's too good at this, so he keeps doing it past the point where it serves him. He gives until there's nothing left and then keeps giving because giving is the only thing that feels like existing with purpose. That's not a character flaw. That's a very specific kind of injury dressed up as a virtue. One more observation about this pattern before we move on, which is about what happens to the relationships that form around a person in the savior role. The people who are helped by Stephen, genuinely helped in ways that change their lives, are in a complicated position with him because the nature of the help hasn't been mutual. He has given. They have received. The power dynamic embedded in that, even when it's not exploitative, is real. When those people grow and change and develop independent lives, as the off-colors do, as Sadie does, as Lars does, the growth registers in Stephen's nervous system as loss rather than success. He helped them become capable of living without him, which is exactly the right outcome, and it feels like rejection. That's a painful bind to be in. Being too good at the very thing that guarantees your own obsolescence. The therapeutic concept of holding an appropriate role is relevant here. A good therapist, a good parent, a good mentor, the measure of success is that the other person eventually needs you less. You work toward your own superfluousness. That requires a very different orientation from the savior pattern, which works toward being permanently indispensable. Stephen has done the former without knowing it, without having the framework to understand that this was the goal. So when it succeeds, he experiences it as failure. That gap between the outcome he's achieved and his ability to feel good about it is part of what Future is navigating. The penultimate episode of Steven Universe, Future, is called I Am My Monster, and it's worth sitting with for a bit, because it does something narratively that most stories about breakdown don't do. By this point in the series, Stephen has been deteriorating for several episodes. His powers are completely out of control. His emotional regulation is gone. He's lashed out at people he loves. He's made himself the center of destructive events because he genuinely cannot hold the pressure inside his body anymore. And in I Am My Monster, the pressure finds its final release. Stephen transforms into a massive gem monster. The same kind of corrupted creature that the crystal gems have been fighting throughout the entire series. This is important. The corrupted gem, the monsters Stephen and the crystal gems fight in the original series, turn out to be gems who were exposed to the Diamond's despair wave at the end of the war, who were psychologically shattered by it and couldn't hold their form anymore. They became monstrous not because they were evil, but because they were overwhelmed. They lost the ability to maintain their shape under the weight of what happened to them. Stephen becomes one of them. He becomes, in the most literal form the show can find, a being who has been overwhelmed, and for a moment, it looks like there might not be a way back from it. What resolves the crisis is not a battle. It's not a clever use of powers. It's not a solution in any conventional story sense. Greg walks up to a giant, devastating, barely recognizable as Stephen monster and holds it. He says, "I love you, Stephen." He says it clearly and simply, without trying to fix anything, without demanding that Stephen stop being a monster in order to receive love. He just loves him as he is, in the worst version of himself, with no conditions attached. That's it. That's what reaches him. The psychological significance of this ending is not incidental. The show is making an explicit argument about what actually helps in the kind of crisis Stephen is in. Not problem solving, not intervention, not someone showing up with the right technique or the right words or the right plan, just unconditional presence. The knowledge that you can be your worst self and not be abandoned. This matters for a specific reason connected to everything we've talked about tonight. The fawn response, the savior pattern, the parentification, the anxious attachment, all of these are strategies for staying connected to others while keeping the most difficult parts of yourself managed and hidden. The implicit contract of all of them is, I will be useful and functional and okay, and in return, you will keep me. Stephen has been living under that contract for his entire life. The monster moment breaks the contract open. He can't be useful, he's not functional. He is very clearly not okay, and Greg loves him anyway. Stephen's return to himself, his reform from the monster, comes as an act of receiving care, which is something he has spent his entire life being functionally unable to do. It is not a coincidence that the thing that heals him is the thing he never let himself have. There's a quiet detail afterward, where multiple characters who have their own complicated histories of trauma, Lapis, Jasper, the people he's hurt and been hurt by, come to him. Not to fight, not to confront, just to witness, to be there. The collective weight of you are seen and you are not alone is what pulls him back. It's a beautiful piece of writing, and it's accurate to how people often describe the turning points in their own recovery. Not the moment they understood something, but the moment they felt genuinely held by someone who wasn't asking them to be different. The show also makes a specific choice about who speaks to Stephen first. It's Greg, not Garnet, who has the most emotional maturity, not Connie, who loves him most clearly. Greg, the person who can't fix anything, who doesn't understand gem powers, who has no framework for what's happening. He just walks up to the monster and says, I love you, without condition. And that's what works. There's something in that choice that feels very true. In the worst moments, the caliber of the wisdom being offered matters less than the sincerity. Greg doesn't have the right words. He has the right feeling, communicated without reservation, and that's what Stephen can actually receive. The corrupted gems throughout the series have always been a quiet background tragedy. Every monster the crystal gems fight in the early seasons is, eventually revealed to be, a gem who couldn't hold together under something too large for them to carry. They lost their form. They became something that needed to be contained and healed rather than something that could function in the world. The show never frames them as villains. It frames them as people who are overwhelmed. Stephen becoming one of them is not a horror moment in the conventional sense. It's a completion of something the show has been building toward. The recognition that the same thing that happened to them can happen to the most capable person in the room if the conditions are wrong enough, for long enough, without support. The word monster in the episode title is interesting. I am my monster. Not, I have become a monster, or I turned into a monster. The possessive suggests something more intimate. This is mine. This is a part of me that has finally surfaced and can no longer be kept down. The monster isn't a separate entity or a condition imposed from outside. It's Stephen, in the most unmanageable and unguarded form of himself. The episode's resolution isn't the defeat of the monster. It's the acceptance of it. It's Greg saying, I see all of you. I'm not leaving. That's enough to bring him back. The final episode of Steven Universe Future is called The Future, and it's deliberately unhurried. Stephen is leaving Beach City, not in crisis, not to fight anything, just to go and see what the world is like and figure out who he is when he's not in relation to anyone's need. He's visiting friends. He's taking some space. He's beginning the process that most people who go through something like what he went through would need. The slow, non-linear work of building a life that fits who you actually are. Before he goes, almost in passing, he mentions that he's been working with a therapist. He says it the way you'd mention starting a new hobby. Matter of fact. Positive. In a quiet way. The show doesn't make it into a scene. It doesn't give a little speech about the importance of mental health. Stephen mentions it, The people around him receive it warmly, and they move on. That's it. And I think that's one of the most carefully considered decisions the show makes in its final run. Because the instinct in storytelling, particularly in children's storytelling, is to either make therapy into a big moment, an important step, a turning point, the solution, or to avoid it entirely as though naming it would make the show feel too serious. Steven Universe Future does neither. It treats therapy as a normal, sensible thing that people do when they need help processing difficult experiences. Full stop. The research on what actually helps with complex trauma and PTSD, the kind of accumulated childhood adversity Stephen is dealing with, is reasonably clear that therapy is one component of recovery, but not a sufficient one on its own. What consistently shows up in the literature alongside therapeutic support are stable relationships, people who are reliably present, and the basic ability to feel safe in your own life. Stephen, at the end of the series, has all three, probably for the first time. He has Greg, he has Connie, he has the crystal gems, who are still figuring themselves out, but who are also genuinely there. He has a community he's helped build. And he has a therapist helping him make sense of the accumulated weight of his childhood. What the show models is not recovery as a destination, but recovery as a direction. He's not fixed at the end. He's not a different person. He's Stephen with access to more of himself, moving toward a life that has room in it for his own needs alongside everyone else's. That's a realistic and meaningful endpoint for the kind of work the show has been doing. And it's one that most stories about emotional struggle don't quite find the nerve to land on. The ending is also deliberate about what it leaves unresolved. It doesn't tidy up the grief about Rose. It doesn't tie up the pink diamond legacy into a clean moral. It doesn't suggest that Amethyst has fully stopped running from her shame, or that Pearl is done grieving, or that the gems have completely healed from thousands of years of complicated history. It just shows them in motion, continuing. That's accurate. Healing from the kind of experiences the show depicts isn't a before and after story, it's an ongoing one. I've got a video in mind at some point about Spinel, who shows up in the movie and is honestly one of the more heartbreaking studies in what abandonment does to a person. And Lapis Lazuli deserves her own treatment. Her arc is a fairly careful portrait of PTSD and dissociation and the particular despair of feeling like your damage is too much to be worth healing. But those are for another time. Plenty more ground to cover at some point. The road trip ending, Stephen leaving in his van, the gems and Greg watching him go, everyone tearful but settled, is a very specific choice. It's not triumphant in the conventional sense. Nobody throws a party. There's no victory to celebrate. Stephen is just going to be by himself, maybe for the first time, in a way that's chosen rather than forced. And there's something in that image that feels earned by everything that came before it. The boy who spent his whole life defined by his relationships with others, setting off to find out who he is in the absence of all that. The show doesn't promise you that he figures it out. That's probably right. Nobody fully figures it out. You just keep going with a little more clarity than you had before and a little better sense of what you need, and some people who will be there when you return. That's the best outcome the research tends to describe for complex trauma recovery. Not resolution, not transformation, just ongoing movement in a direction that has more room in it for the whole person. It's a gentle ending, appropriately so. The show could have gone bigger, a more dramatic resolution, a clearer triumph, a more decisive statement that things are different now. It didn't. It went quiet. It went true. Stephen drives off in a van toward an uncertain future, which is exactly the right image for a character who spent years trying to make every future certain for everyone else. Now he gets to not know. Now he gets to find out. That's a hopeful thing, if you sit with it a moment. I find it genuinely interesting that a cartoon aimed at children ended up being one of the more psychologically precise television depictions of trauma and recovery in recent memory. Not the most dramatic, not the most intense, but one of the most honest about how the actual mechanics of these things work. The fawn response, the savior pattern, a CS, What happens to a person's body when they've been afraid for too long? The particular kind of grief that comes from losing an idealized image of someone who was always more complicated than the image allowed. These aren't simple things. They're things that therapists and researchers have spent decades trying to understand. And a show about a half-human, half-alien boy with healing powers managed to render them in a way that a 10-year-old could watch and feel recognized. Rebecca Sugar said in an interview about the show's final season that she wanted to make something that would tell children it's okay to not be okay. That help exists. That the people who love you can hold you even when you're at your worst. That healing is possible. Though it's slow and it doesn't straighten you out entirely, it just gives you more room to breathe. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. I think what I find most affecting about the show, sitting with it from this angle, is how clearly it understands that the same qualities that make someone remarkable can also be the source of their damage. Steven's empathy is real and extraordinary. It's also what has left him without a stable sense of himself. His capacity for care is enormous. It's also what trained him to be everyone else's emotional anchor before he had the resources to carry it. These are not contradictions to resolve. They're held together, honestly, in the same character across the same run of television. He is genuinely the best person to have in a crisis. He is also genuinely the last person who knows how to let himself rest. That tension doesn't resolve cleanly, because it doesn't in real life either. You don't get to choose which parts of your history shaped you. You get to choose what you do with the whole package, ideally with some help, ideally with a little more self-knowledge than you started with. Steven, at the end of the series, is choosing. That's enough. There's a lot more to be said about the world of the show. About Homeworld's caste system as a metaphor for the systemic oppression and the particular harm it does even to those who enforce it. About what the diamonds represent as figures of authority whose emotional lives have calcified into control. About Connie's arc as a parallel study in maintaining selfhood under pressure. And Lapis Lazuli, whose story is genuinely its own thing. A portrait of someone who survived something terrible, found a tentative peace, then had to evacuate it when the past came back. Her arc in future is brief and underserved, but what's there is honest. Peridot is interesting too. The process of someone who was entirely products of a dehumanizing system, slowly discovering that they have opinions and preferences and feelings that the system never told them they were allowed to have. That's a different kind of identity work than Steven's. But it's recognizable, and the show handles it with care. But for tonight, this is a good place to rest. There's more to say. There's always more to say about a show this carefully made. But it'll keep. Sleep well.